Okay, thank you very much for your introduction, Ingolfur. And actually, I'm a bit disappointed that your title was From Rapid Action to Deep Inquiry. And I am disappointed because I would have liked to seen this the other way around. I would have liked that we have done our deep inquiry already quite a while ago, and that we are now talking about rapid action. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Now I'm going to take you to a bit of a narrow road. I'm going to focus on the individualist perspective, and for some of you that's a disappointment maybe. But that's what social psychologists and psychologists are looking from, that perspective. So I'm going to talk about behavior of individuals, be it in social context. And the first question I would like to talk about is, what is sustainable behavior? So this talk will be actually being carried around three different areas. So I'm going to talk about sustainable behavior. What is sustainable behavior from the perspective of individuals? Going to talk about determinants of behavior and barriers to sustainability. Then I will talk about habits, and then I will finally talk about behavior change. So let's first talk about, well, what is sustainable behavior from the perspective of ordinary people? And actually, I tried to collect bits and pieces of evidence from studies that we recently did. Studies were not aimed to answer this question, but I was intrigued by the question, well, if we talk about sustainability, what does that mean for people? Now, for instance, in one study, we asked participants what their worries were about the ecology. So the top 5 ecological worries were these: climate change, pollution, biodiversity, depletion of resources, and deforestation. In another study, we asked participants to talk about sustainability, and actually what we inferred from those interviews were actually there were two things that participants immediately associated with sustainability. One is this one, recycling, and the other theme is something about future generations. And I say it deliberately very vague, because what we got from these interviews, what people were talking about, yes, we have to preserve something, we have to preserve the earth, there are our children and grandchildren, but they were not very specific. It was always far away and very vague. So that's about what we got from these interviews. We also did a study recently where we asked participants to give us ratings about what they were doing, and without going into all the methodological issues, what we did, we put these data into a scaling program where we try to map out what and figure out how are people organizing behaviors that relate to sustainability. How are they organizing these mentally? And we came up with these 5 clusters. So it's energy use, technology, food and shopping, the physical environments, and gardening. It's actually a bit of a scattered kind of answer to the question, what do people think when they associate on sustainability? So let's talk about behavior. And I would like to go through a model of behavior, let's say determinants of behavior, and be assured I'm not going to use this model. This actually would probably be a better representation of reality. I'm going to boil down reality to a couple of very simple concepts. This is what social psychologists usually think of determinants of behavior. So this is a model that has been around in social and consumer and environmental psychology for quite a while. The model is called the theory of planned behavior, which actually has sort of functioned as a framework for thinking about behavior, but also for interventions to change behavior. And I just going to walk you through this model, and I'm going to do that also with the perspective of, well, what are exactly the barriers to sustainable behavior. So this model, first of all, portrays an attitude. So let's say the behavior is the outcome of this model, and attitudes are one of the determinants. And when we look at attitudes, we are looking at what people are expecting of their behavior. What consequences do they see of their behavior? And in terms of sustainability, there are lots of barriers. First of all, people don't know very much about the sustainability consequences of the various things they could do or not do. And it's also a very difficult issue. It's very difficult, for instance, to know about what in terms of, let's say, carbon footprints, what does it mean by all your life switching off the lights or taking a flight to Spain? It's a very difficult question to compare the sustainability consequences of behavior. So there is definitely a lack of knowledge. There's also what we call judgmental discounting, which has to do with the fact that all the consequences that we're talking about today are very difficult to imagine. It's of course we have the storms and we have the flooding, but climate change is a very complicated issue. It is also unfolding in terms of large timescales. The consequences may be far away in time and geography, and that all leads to biases in our judgments. We also have risk perceptions that are also driven by principles like, for instance, salience of events. Events that are very salient increase our judgments of risk. Events that are unseen or that gradually unfold are very much seen as low risk, and that there are lots of psychological principles involved in how we explain, how we judge risks. All these barriers leads maybe to difficulty to perceive consequences of behavior. We also behave in a social environment, so there is lots of our behaviors are influenced by what we think other people think we should do or what we think other people are doing. So we have what we call injunctive norms, what we think other people think we should do, descriptive norms, what we think majority of people or people around us are doing. And if these norms are not sustainable, then that is a very big barrier to our own behavior. Our direct social environment, so where do these norms come from? Of course, people we relate to, our direct, our social environment, friends, family, and so on, our community and the government. These sources of norms, so to speak, may not be very conducive to sustainable choices. And I point in particular to government. I think many individuals are absolutely not inspired by what our government, and I'm not talking about this government only, but previous governments as well, and probably the next government is putting on offer in terms of sustainability. The greenest government ever, we heard Cameron say, I think, once or twice in the beginning of his term, and never again. Labour doesn't have any good alternatives either, and I think it's really actually a disgrace what the norms that come from the let's say the powers that be in terms of sustainability. We also can frame sustainability in terms of a social dilemma. It's a whole area in psychology where basically it is a system in which individuals actually have to contribute to the common good, but it's very difficult for an individual to see that. It's very difficult to be motivated by that, and the common good is something that is only materializing if really everyone is contributing. Relatedly, the NIMBY effect, not in my backyard, is also related to a problem of social influence. And then thirdly, there are skills and perceived difficulties of behavior. Some behaviors are simply difficult to perform. people sometimes don't know how to do things. Let me give you some examples of that in a minute. So sometimes there's the infrastructure which is not right. Sometimes there's lack of skills or poor instructions, and I got some examples of that. If we're confronted with instructions like these, or like these, or this, then it's really disappointing, and it is amazing how institutions or local governments or whoever is producing these things assume that people behave according to these kind of instructions. And these instructions are actually completely rubbish. This is the worst one. You all probably know about that. So the right-hand side of the model has to do with, well, suppose that we have our beliefs and norms and perception of control such that we are actually motivated, or that we think it's a good idea to do sustainable behaviors, then there's a big problem in terms of turning that into actual behavior. So there's a big gap between our intentions and behavior, and it has to do with motivation, willpower, and a lot of other things that social psychologists have been looking at. So one reason why intentions may not materialize into behaviors that they're not empowered by, for instance, environmental values. Environmental values are something that is very difficult to grasp. We've done quite a lot of research on that, and even individuals who adhere to environmental values or who say it's very important, there is still a gap between what those kind of beliefs and those kinds of conceptions and actual behavior in real life. So there's also lots of competing goals. Many of behaviors that we talk about, sustainability-related behaviors, are behaviors that we don't do because of sustainable, producing a sustainable environment. We do that because they are serving us. They are serving other goals than sustainability. So there are lots of competing goals and values that our behaviors that we would like to promote have to compete with. And intentions simply get lost. There's a whole area in social psychology where we look at, well, why are people who have a genuine intention not behaving according to those intentions? And there are all kinds of reasons for that. Intentions may not be well formed. There may be competing alternative goals in play, and so on and so forth. But taken together, there's a whole lot needed in order for intentions to be actually materializing into behavior. And there's habituation. That's our next topic that I'm going to talk about, because lots of behaviors are behaviors we do time and again. We repeat behaviors every day, and that has consequences. And I'm going to talk about that now. So, sort of common sense tells us that it's difficult to change habits, and lots of sustainability-related behaviors are strongly habitual. So most of the time, what we do is what we do most of the time, and that has consequences. So let me just take a few minutes to think about, to talk about what habits are and what consequences habits have. And I do that along, let's say, 3 pillars of habits. The first is that, of course, habits are repetitive. And that's important. It's the psychologist's kind of definition of habits so far. But it's important also because the cumulative effect of lots of behaviors are making these behaviors important for us. So it's not at all any problem to take the car for a ride, but if populations commute by car a long time, then of course that has significant effects. Importantly about habits is that these are automatic behaviors. So we are doing things on the automatic pilot, and automaticity can be sort of broken down into a couple of features. So for instance, we are not aware that we are doing something, that we are making choices. So there's a lack of conscious intent. Sometimes it's difficult to control behavior, and there's sort of mental efficiency. We do things simultaneously. Now these things are not very are difficult when you want to change behavior. When people are not aware of their choices and what they're doing, then of course it's more difficult to change those behaviors. And thirdly, habits are what we call cue controlled. Habits are sort of elicited by the environment in which we operate. So the time cues, locations, specific situations, specific people, mood, physiological states, and social practices, which sort of elicit habits as part of larger routines and complex behavior. The sort of takeaway message of this is that, well, we very often think that we control our behavior and that we are in control, that we have our willpower, we have our choices. But when habits are established, then actually you could say that the control of behavior is really transferred to the environment rather than being internal. So habits are difficult in terms of change, and we've done a lot of research in the past decade on let's say what habits are really doing, the consequences of habits for instance, information processing, for the way people make choices, and I can just summarize that, by saying that habits lead to what you call tunnel vision. There's no interest in new information. There's a very shallow decision-making process, and habits, strong habits, even if policy makers very often think, well, as long as you put your information out, as long as you grab the attention of people, then they of course want to see our messages. Well, the answer is a big no. People are not interested in information if they are in a habitual mode. There is no way you can really assume that anything that is being put out, let's say marketed, is being picked up. It's not. The second is, well, there's also what you may call, and I just referred to that, there's a gap between intention and behavior. Now that gap is extremely wide when we talk about habits. And actually we've done quite a lot of studies and others to show that when there are strong habits, that actually our intentions and our willpower, our attitudes are pretty much unrelated to what we do. And that means also that if you want to change behavior, and if you actually grab the intention of your target population, and if you are changing their attitudes and intention, well, if there's a gap between intention and behavior, then actually it's also bad news. There's a third, so this is in terms of our model, the tunnel vision prevents information to change attitudes, norms, and so on and so forth, and the intention-behavior gap is wide, and for behavior that is strongly habitual. There's a third problem, which is that habits are rewarding, and particularly unsustainable habits. They serve other goals that are very important for us. It's about money, it's about comfort, efficiency. Habits are, they are under control of social rewards, part of other routines, and this makes habits extremely difficult to change. So, are there any solutions? Now, of course, this is sort of wrapping up a lot of stuff, but there are people, of course, there are different ways to think in terms of behavior change, to think along different paths. And for instance, one is segmentation. Sorry for the bad quality of this slide, but this is a segmentation model produced by DEFRA. Actually quite an interesting model, because what they try to do is to identify different sections of the population with different needs and different values, in order to explore different ways of designing interventions to target these groups. And they did that by putting on a sort of two-dimensional space. On the one hand, the willingness to act, which may be low or high, and the other dimension, the ability to act, the opportunities people have, low and high. And this sort of creates different sections which actually can be identified. So, for instance, people who really are very motivated to act, willing to act, and has opportunities to act. Well, they actually should be pampered. Life should be made easy to do things. On the other hand, there may be people who really are not motivated at all to act, and maybe also don't have the opportunity to act. And there are different. There's a very different kettle of fish. What I would like to just briefly to talk about is our own research. What we have been investigating lately is the hypothesis that well, maybe interventions, and there are actually interventions out there that have been developed. And we started out with the idea that, well, if habits are very, very difficult to change, then maybe we should look for opportunities or situations where habits are changing in a natural fashion. And they sometimes do for a little while. And that happens, for instance, during life course changes, when people move from school to work, moving house, starting family, retirement. Those are situations where old habits are temporarily broken or suspended for a while. Think about moving house. You have to find new ways of doing things. And very quickly old habits kick in again. The hypothesis that we try to investigate is that, well, if you focus intervention, behavior change interventions on that little window where habits are temporarily suspended or broken, then maybe those interventions provide for more value for money. Because new solutions are needed in that little window. Information might be useful, and people might be in the mood for change. And that may lead to new behavior. So we try to find out whether these interventions do provide more value for money. And we did that by, very briefly, and I'm not going into all the details of that, we conducted a large field experiment in the city of Peterborough, where we had 800 households who were divided in 4 groups. There were people who had recently moved, and they were matched with non-movers, and half of each group received a behavior change intervention. It was a bespoke intervention, and half of them did not. They were a control group, and we measured 2 times their behaviors, 25 behaviors. The intervention was conducted by the Peterborough Environment City Trust. Personal interview, free sustainable items, tailored information. It was a whole package, actually quite an intensive intervention. But our aim, our objective was to find out whether this intervention worked better when people just had moved house. And that is actually what we found, and I'm not going into the statistical stuff here, but what we found was, while controlling for all the determinants that we could find that were relevant, we did find indeed that that behavior change was actually a little bit better, a bit more prevalent among the groups that had moved house and got the intervention. So, proof of concept. And this is what, in a bit more detail, if you look here at the different groups, we blocked also the movers into 2 groups. Those who moved recently, 3 months, 6 months, more than half a year, and 3.5 years. The green is the intervention group, the blue is the control group. Positive means more behavior change, and as you can see, that actually the only effect that we had the intervention had was among movers who had recently moved. That's a very interesting group. So this little window of opportunity that existed in this case by moving house. This is something we would like to explore further, of course. Now, there are lots of other interesting interventions developed. They all could be labeled as downstream interventions, so interventions aimed at individual behaviors. Whereas, of course, there is also the opportunity to think about upstream interventions, large-scale interventions, for instance, legislation, new technologies, and infrastructural changes, which sort of directly impact on people's behavior. So the question might be asked, do you really need us, social psychologists? Can policy makers and politicians not do this and change behavior? And the answer sometimes is yes. I think it is. We've seen very good examples of that. So early on, the introduction of seat belts, recently the smoking ban, changing light bulbs from the old-fashioned ones to the more efficient ones, congestion charging. Those are all actually large-scale interventions, behavior change interventions, top-down and very effective. Not only very effective, but also maybe there has been a bit of moaning initially among certain people, but actually, if you look at how these large-scale interventions have panned out, they have been very, very much, to a large degree, accepted by the general public. Interesting, the smoking ban even among smokers. So, what we, in terms of our model, we can suggest that well, these things are directly leading to behavior change, and actually we can reverse our thinking about behavior change. So rather than thinking about changing attitudes and values, well, actually we've done that the past 30 years. And I can really tell you, in my career, when I started my career in the early 80s, we had workshops like this. We had workshops where we talked about how can we change people's behavior, how can we change values, how can we change attitudes, and it's actually really a bit sort of difficult to think about. Well, where did we get? Why are we still having these workshops after 30 years? So maybe there is an argument for saying, well, let's do action, let's change behavior, and well, our profession can actually do things, because it may be that behavior change leads also to change in attitudes and values and norms and so on, and maybe psychologists can play a role there, which then consolidates behavior change and make behavior change acceptable. So, in a nutshell, and a very brief overview of why I think, on the one hand, that individual behavior change is extremely difficult, and there are very naive ideas among politicians, among policymakers, change agents in general, about changing behavior. It's very difficult, it's very complicated. On the other hand, there are also groups and people, and I just remind you of the segmentation model, and we identified these people also in our research. There are people out there who are genuinely concerned about the environment. There are businesses who are actually genuinely motivated to work towards a more sustainable environment. Not many, but there are some. And there are a handful of politicians who may also be genuinely concerned about the environment. Now, I think, if you imagine yourself in the year 2021, well, these people that I talked about, those are the people who have to carry the sustainability agenda. Large scores of population, large scores of politicians, large scores of businesses are not interested in sustainability. But these smaller groups of people, these pockets of genuinely concerned people, businesses, politicians, those are the ones they need to carry on. And when our great-grandchildren in the year 2100 are looking back to the beginning of the century, then I really hope that they will see that these people and these businesses and these politicians never lost hope, and things turned for the better. Thank you very much.